Good morning, everyone. Susana McDermott here. Thanks for joining. We are going to get started in just 2 minutes or so just hang on. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Susana McDermott, Director of Communications at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. On behalf of ICCR staff and our members, we welcome you to this overview of our 2020 Proxy Book and Voting Guide. ICCR's Proxy Book is an annual compilation of shareholder resolutions filed or co-filed by ICCR members as of the end of January. We published the Proxy Book and are convening this webinar to invite support for these proposals and the environmental and social concerns they raise. For those of you who may be meeting us for the first time, I want to just take 1 minute to briefly introduce ICCR. Established nearly 50 years ago, ICCR is a coalition of over 300 institutional investors who use their collective leverage as shareholders in global corporations to advocate for improved social and environmental performance. ICCR's membership comprises a wide spectrum of institutional investors, faith-based organizations, socially responsible asset management firms, unions, pension funds, NGOs, foundations, and other responsible investors. In 2018, ICCR launched the Investor Alliance for Human Rights to grow the network and build capacity of investors engaging on business and human rights concerns. While our members make use of the proxy process to gain board and management's attention around specific ESG concerns, the filing of shareholder resolutions is only one of many engagement strategies they employ, and the vast majority of our members are communicating with companies on a regular basis about these and many other issues throughout the year. ICCR's work is coordinated around priority issue areas identified by our members. Current priorities are human rights, climate change, food, water, and health equity. You will see these engagement themes, along with others brought by our members, reflected throughout the Proxy Book. On virtually all of these concerns, unfortunately, we are seeing significant erosion of the regulatory frameworks meant to foster greater corporate accountability. Further, proposed new rules by the SEC will significantly restrict shareholders' ability to bring these issues forward via the corporate proxy. For this reason, investor support for these proposals is critically important. It is our hope that this brief overview of our Proxy Book will not just pique your interest in the full slate of proposals our members are sponsoring this year, but that it will catalyze discussions around ways we can strengthen our collaborations on these and other issues of common concern. We are very mindful that we don't do this work alone and want to recognize here the significant contributions and support of our allies and partners, many of whom are on this call. Just a few housekeeping points before I turn this over to Julie and our members. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. We have reserved the last 15 minutes for a Q&A, and our speakers will be on the line to answer your questions at that time. Due to the large number of participants, we are asking that you submit your questions through the question box you should have at the bottom right of your screen. And we encourage you to submit these questions as they come up during the course of the webinar, as opposed to waiting until the last minute in order to get them in the queue. When typing in your questions, please tell us three things: your name, organization, and which speaker the question is directed to. Whatever we can't get to on the call today, we promise to follow up on afterwards via email. Okay, so let's get started. We will begin with an overview of the guide from my colleague Julie Wokaty, followed by some context setting from Beth Young about the status of proposed rules at the SEC I mentioned earlier, and any impact we may be seeing on the 2020 proxy season. Afterwards, we'll hear directly from ICCR members about their proposals. And now to provide that overview, here is Julie Wokaty, who does a yeoman's job every year pulling together the proxy book. Jules?
Good morning. ICCR began annually publishing the Proxy Resolutions and Voting Guide in 1974, just a few years after our inception. As Susana mentioned, the guide contains the full text of shareholder resolutions spanning 10 issue areas and represents ICCR member filings as of February 21st. A link to download the guide will be sent to you following today's webinar. And for those of you who may be new to the proxy process, we also include a guide to filing shareholder proposals on page 221. These resolutions are also available on our website, iccr.org, under the 2020 Resolutions tab. So I'll take us through some key trends from this year's guide. Our members filed 254 resolutions, up slightly from 250 this time last year. An additional 9 filings are planned for the spring. This year saw a greater diversification and volume of human rights-related asks. Investors presented corporations with a large and diverse set of requests, including several proposals calling for the adoption of a human rights policy and human rights risk assessments, and for the appointment of board members with human rights expertise. As a result of the work being done by the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, this year also saw increasing use of the UNGPs as a framework for conducting human rights due diligence across a range of sectors, underscoring their mainstreaming in corporate engagements. Investors this year also remain concerned about the growing impact of tech giants such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon. ICCR members filed 9 proposals at Amazon, more than they sent to any other company this year. The Amazon resolutions featured requests related to climate change, food waste, diversity, lobbying, and product safety. More than half, though, focused on human rights, including hate speech. Investors also filed 7 with Alphabet, addressing such topics as child sexual exploitation, whistleblowers, government censorship, and the gender and racial pay gap. They also filed 6 with Facebook, addressing, for instance, human rights board oversight and the need for an independent chair. There were also 7 resolutions referencing immigration, including detention, biometric data, due diligence regarding customer use of surveillance products, involuntary transportation, funding of Core Civic and Geo Group, and corporate lobbying. There was also a significant focus on banks' fossil fuel lending and the proxy voting policies of large asset managers. There were a number of new topics this year, including changing company management systems to implement the BRT's Statement of Purpose, human capital management disclosure, human rights risks related to U.S. immigration policy, the impact of plant closures, including non-management employees on the board, offshore drilling impacts, rebooting Facebook to address mismanagement around privacy, and reviewing company policies related to involuntary transportation. This slide shows resolution filings by issue area according to volume of filings. For the first time, resolutions related to human rights and worker rights were the most numerous at 52. They exceeded resolutions directly addressing climate change, which was the second most active issue with 45 resolutions. Lobbying and political spending saw 43 resolutions and inclusiveness 42. Corporate governance saw 27 filings, the environment and health 17 each, food 13, and water 7. As I mentioned earlier, resolutions related to human rights and worker rights were the most active category of filings. Concerns included technology and data privacy immigration, child sexual exploitation, ethical labor recruitment, prison labor and supply chains, gun violence, human capital, and conflict zones. The guide this year groups these filings by issue of concern to make navigating this section more intuitive. You'll find this index on page 139. ICCR members this year asked 15 companies to address forced labor and human trafficking in their supply chains. Caroline Boden will fill us in on these resolutions momentarily. Also, later in our webinar, Amina Rubin will analyze this year's human rights risk resolutions submitted to tech companies. 2019 was the second hottest year ever recorded, closing out the warmest decade. Shareholder resolutions are increasingly seen as an important tool for accelerating corporate climate action. ICCR members this year filed 45 resolutions directly addressing climate change. ICCR members asked 10 companies to align their operations and investments with the Paris Agreement's goals. They also called on 7 companies to issue reports on increasing their use of renewable energy. 9 resolutions were filed at banks addressing fossil fuel financing. Other resolutions address the risk of stranded assets, the risk of expanding operations in flood-prone areas, and mitigating carbon footprints of vehicle fleets. Investors also asked BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, T. Rowe Price, and Vanguard funds to issue reports on their proxy voting practices related to climate change. You will hear more about this group of resolutions in a moment from Tim Smith. There were 43 resolutions addressing corporate lobbying and political spending disclosure. This year, ICCR members sought to highlight corporate lobbying on issues such as immigrant detention in private prisons, background checks for gun purchases, high U.S. drug prices, and airplane safety. Their work is being coordinated by AFSCME and Boston Trust Walden. Resolutions on climate lobbying ticked up slightly to 18 from 15 last year. Exxon and Chevron, meanwhile, each received 2 different types of climate lobbying resolutions. Corporate political donations and their outsized influence on U.S. elections and public policy also remain a concern. ICCR members filed 8 resolutions calling for disclosure of corporate political spending. Our work on political spending is coordinated by the Center for Political Accountability. Of the 42 diversity and inclusiveness resolutions filed this year, 8 called for expanded workforce diversity and for reports identifying employees according to the major EEOC-defined job categories. Investors also filed 8 resolutions calling for greater board diversity. Executive leadership diversity also returned as an investor concern for a second year with 6 resolutions. ICCR members again this year pressed corporations to address their gender and racial pay gaps, filing resolutions at 4 companies. Members also filed 1 resolution calling for a report on mandatory arbitration and its impact on workplace culture, continuing the work begun last year. Another 7 resolutions called for companies to update their workplace discrimination policies to include language prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender identity or expression. Sound corporate governance structures are the bedrock of healthy long-term financial performance that creates value for all stakeholders. 11 of this year's 27 governance-related resolutions emphasized the importance of independent board chairs, including a third-year Facebook proposal. Investors in pharma companies filed independent board requests at 6 companies, including at Johnson & Johnson, referencing mismanagement of opioid risks, and Lilly, highlighting the rising cost of insulin. A new group of 6 resolutions also made the case for employee representation on corporate boards. In August of last year, CEO members of the Business Roundtable released a joint statement on the purpose of the corporation, declaring the end of shareholder primacy. As a result, BlackRock was this year asked to prepare a report on how its governance and management systems should be altered to fully implement the BRT's statement of purpose. This year also saw 2 pay disparity and say-on-pay resolutions filed at Canadian companies. Managing and reporting on ESG factors, such as environmental impacts and resource dependency, helps companies compete in a business environment driven by increasing public sensitivity to waste and pollution, finite natural resources, and growing public expectations for corporate accountability. Influenced by the worsening plastic pollution crisis, this year Walmart was asked to issue a report on the impact of single-use plastic bags. Altogether, investors asked a dozen companies this year to issue reports discussing potential solutions to plastic pollution. A final resolution in this group asked Amazon for better board oversight of ESG risks from third-party sellers. Americans paid over $344 billion for their medications in 2018, an increase of $20 billion from 2015. These skyrocketing drug prices hurt not only patients, but present business risks for manufacturers. ICCR members asked 8 companies this year to address drug pricing risk via their executive incentive structures. You'll hear more about these resolutions in a moment from Nicholas Lusiani. Shareholders also carry their opioid campaign into its 3rd year, filing 4 resolutions urging companies to establish a deferral period for senior executive bonuses as a way of encouraging better governance structures related to opioids. They also filed 3 resolutions asking companies for greater oversight of risks related to the opioid crisis. Investors this year also asked Merck to report on how it plans to allocate its tax savings for the Trump administration's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There was also 1 resolution on youth vaping. In order to grow the food necessary for an expanding global population, industrial agriculture, characterized by large-scale monoculture, heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and CAFOs, has become the predominant method of food production. This has led to serious and unmanaged environmental and social impacts. This year, several resolutions highlighted the role of agriculture and deforestation in driving the climate crisis, as well as the impact of future climate-related water redistribution and reduced availability. In addition, 5 other resolutions called on companies to take action on the routine use of antibiotics in animal agriculture. 4 asked companies to report quantitative metrics on pesticide use in their supply chains, and 1 called for a reduction of food waste. And now a note on voluntary withdrawals. When shareholders file a proposal, companies may reach out to the filers and request a dialogue to discuss aspects of the proposal. If an agreement between both parties is reached that satisfies the main request of the proposal, such as issuing a report or amending a policy, filers may choose to voluntarily withdraw the resolution, which then does not appear on the company's proxy statement. Every year, ICCR members negotiate many such successful agreements. Last year was another strong year for the ICCR coalition, as our members negotiated 107 corporate commitments on a broad range of issues. So far this year, ICCR members have withdrawn 37 resolutions in exchange for substantive agreements with companies, up slightly from 35 1 year ago. Examples include Carnival, Western Union, Chipotle, Nucor, and also Tyson, CVS, First Cash, and East Group. We do expect the number of withdrawals to grow in the next few months and to be consistent with what we saw last year. Our website will provide an update on these withdrawal agreements and vote results in early summer when the proxy season comes to a close. And now we'll move on to our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julie. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Beth Young, Shareholder Initiatives Counsel, who will share a bit more about the proposed rule changes to 14A8 process and what they could mean for investors going forward. So take it away, Beth.
Thank you. So most of you probably are aware that in November, the SEC proposed significant changes to Rule 14A8. And as you can see on the slide, there were about 4 or 5 major areas in which those proposed changes fill. The SEC proposed to significantly increase the ownership threshold for eligibility to submit a proposal, to raise the vote thresholds that must be obtained in order for a proposal to be resubmitted, to adopt new limitations on shareholders' ability to use a representative for the shareholder proposal process, including a new 1 proposal per company per representative rule, and to require that proponents make themselves available during a short window after proposal submission to meet with the company. Now, it's worth noting up front, before I talk in detail, that the proposing release left open the possibility that even more stringent provisions will ultimately be adopted than the ones that were formally proposed by the SEC in November. And the reason that's possible is that the SEC in the release asked numerous questions, and those questions provide an opportunity for companies to offer support for even tougher revisions to the rule. So even though those were not formally proposed, if the SEC concludes that there's sufficient support for those tougher versions, they can elect to go with those in the final adopting release. So even though it's clear that the SEC has a mandate or an order sort of to make changes to Rule 14a8, it's not entirely clear what those changes will look like. So as you can see on the slide, right now a shareholder has to hold $2,000 worth of company stock for at least a year in order to be eligible to submit a proposal. The SEC has proposed to adopt the tiered threshold described on the slide, which means that small shareholders must hold for 3 years now, and only those shareholders owning $25,000 or more in company stock can submit after only 1 year of ownership. So for institutional shareholders, the longer holding periods increase the likelihood that an event that disrupts continuity of ownership, like a custodian or manager change, will prevent a shareholder from being eligible to submit a proposal. And that will occur regardless of the fact that the shareholder continued to have economic exposure to the company stock during the entire time period. Second, the SEC proposed to increase the voting thresholds that must be obtained in order for a proposal to be resubmitted from 3%, 6%, and 10% if a proposal has been voted on 1, 2, or 3 or more times in the last 5 years, to 5%, 15%, and 25%. A new momentum requirement was also proposed in the release, which would allow exclusion under certain circumstances when a proposal's support dips by more than 10%, even if that proposal has achieved more than the highest level of the resubmission threshold. So the way that the resubmission threshold works is that it bars not just the exact same proposal from being resubmitted, but also proposals on, quote, substantially the same subject matter, unquote. And the SEC staff has interpreted that language fairly expansively, which means that proponents will need to be very thoughtful about what kind of proposal they want to submit if a previous proposal has been barred due to failure to reach the resubmission threshold. The higher thresholds, I think, will also shift the balance during engagement and settlement of proposals, because a lower vote will have consequences more quickly. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about where we are in the overall regulatory comment process. The deadline for comments was February 3rd, and over 1,000 comments have been received as of today, the majority from the investor community. ICCR did a great job in supporting its members in submitting comments that drew on their own experiences, which are especially valuable in the comment process. The SEC really has to take seriously concrete information that commenters provide, when in addition to sort of more policy-oriented arguments. Many of the comments focused on the fact that the SEC almost entirely downplayed the benefits that are provided by the shareholder proposal process and chose instead to fixate on the costs of the process to companies, which are actually quite small, even in light of the size of U.S. public companies. So commenters, I think, did a great job pointing out that Rule 14a8 allows investors to flag emerging issues, and many of the proposals you'll hear about today fall into that category or did when they were first introduced. That proposals lead to a lot of value-enhancing changes in governance and corporate behavior. The SEC ignored a very abundant academic literature on this point, and that disclosure proposals improve the quality of information available to the market, which is increasingly important with the real explosion in use of ESG data in investing. Many comments also pointed out that the higher resubmission thresholds are ill-advised, because we've seen over and over again how issues take time to catch on as shareholders learn about them and as external events give the issues increased saliency. These new thresholds would prematurely cut off debate around issues like climate and sexual orientation discrimination, and even things like board declassification, that started slow but ultimately achieved widespread acceptance. And finally, the inconsistency between the SEC's move to raise the ownership threshold and Chairman Clayton's frequent invocation of the Main Street or retail investor as the Commission's highest priority was highlighted by many commenters who noticed the Commission's own finding, which it buried in a footnote in the release, that the higher ownership thresholds would disproportionately eliminate the most value-enhancing proposals. Comments were submitted. This was a really unusual comment process. Comments were submitted by members of Congress, an FEC commissioner, the SEC's own investor advisory committee, and many, many academics. Very few individual companies commented, although their trade associations did weigh in. The SEC will need to review these comments and address issues raised in the release adopting any changes. We have heard that the White House has given the Commission a hard deadline of April, and it will be challenging to review all of these comments and address the issues they raise in that time frame, especially comments that called for additional data. An inadequate analysis in the adopting release will provide a basis for litigation. So despite the shortcomings that I've just outlined in the SEC's analysis and the possibility of litigation, investors should be prepared for these new rules to be in place for the 2021 proxy season.
Great. Beth, thanks so much for that. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Tim Smith, Director of ESG Shareowner Engagement for Boston Trust Walden, who's going to talk to us about shareholder proposals regarding proxy voting and lobbying policies related to climate change. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm going to start off, we're going to talk about climate change in large part this morning. But let me start off with a quote, and it reads, "The longer action is delayed, the more costly it will be to deal with the issues. Moreover, a delayed policy response opens us up to potentially catastrophic outcomes, which may be impossible to reverse. We cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened." So here's the quiz. You can think about it. Who said this? Bill McKibben, a brilliant environmental advocate? ICCR? Theories? No, it was J.P. Morgan Chase in his new white paper on climate change called J.P. Morgan Risky Business. So perhaps Jamie Dimon has this as a belief in his heart of hearts. And there are other new voices raising the alarm bell about climate change. I think all of you are probably aware that in his annual letter to CEOs, BlackRock Chair and CEO Larry Fink noted that climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects. Then he said the impact of climate change on economic growth and prosperity is a risk that markets to date have been slow to reflect on, but awareness is rapidly changing, and I believe we are on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance, he concluded. So the urgency of now is being confirmed by new sources, by major voices in the investment community that start off looking at risks to us as investors and risks to companies. So you don't have to uncritically endorse the climate positions of companies like BlackRock or J.P. Morgan, but it is highly significant that these giants in global finance are talking about the urgency of climate change and the need to find solutions. And of course, ICCR members and other investors are filing resolutions urging companies to take this forward-looking kind of action. I wanted to reflect quickly on a new approach to climate change this year, and that's resolutions that are described as climate lobbying. And BNP Paribas Asset Management and other investors filed resolutions, for example, with Exxon, Chevron, United Airlines, and Delta, urging them to reevaluate their public policy advocacy related to climate. This theme isn't new. For 10 years, investors have been pressing companies to expand their disclosure on lobbying and political spending. But now there's a focus in particular on how companies are spending their dollars and their lobbying power on public policy related to climate. And as you've heard from Julie, overall there's about 35 resolutions on lobbying disclosure and 4 on climate lobbying this year. This campaign builds on aggressive actions that were taking place in Europe last year, who urged European companies to make sure that their lobbying was consistent with the Paris Accord. And there's over 15 companies that have agreed to do that. So it's not just a stretch goal. Shell and most recently British Petroleum did reviews of what their trade associations were saying and doing on climate change. And BP announced that they had withdrawn from 3 U.S. trade associations because they said their positions were misaligned with those of BP. So this new investor demand has been put before 47 companies in the U.S. that are part of a focus of Climate 100 Plus. And investors in September wrote letters to these 47 companies, investors with $6.5 trillion of assets under management backing them. So U.S. companies are being asked to take this same pledge, and dialogues are continuing in negotiations with companies. So this is a season which is an opportunity to forward that agenda. Many companies, unfortunately, are still highly reluctant to disclose their major trade associations that they're part of, but we see that the door opening on that too. So let's turn briefly to a final point, which is the role of major institutional money managers and how they vote their proxies. So this year, as Julie said, shareholder resolutions were presented to BlackRock, Vanguard, T. Rowe Price, and J.P. Morgan Chase, asking them to look at how they're voting their proxies on climate change. J.P. Morgan Chase, for example, had only voted for 2 resolutions in 2019, a dismal record. But interesting, BlackRock, in its recent announcement about its climate change positions, also indicated it was expanding its stewardship engagement with companies it owns and listed numerous steps they expected companies to take. And then they said that they would hold boards accountable and vote against boards of directors that were unresponsive on climate change. State Street said the same thing about boards of directors, and I know that Legal & General and other big companies and pension funds are voting against some boards that are backward-looking on climate. Just so you know, the shareholder resolutions of BlackRock was withdrawn, and there's going to be discussions this summer when we have a chance to look at their proxy voting record this spring. You should know that they've agreed to disclose their proxy votes quarterly, which is a very important step. Now, J.P. Morgan has also come out this week with a new position on climate change. It's notable. It's things that the bank will not lend to because of climate change, but it's still unclear how this will influence their asset management division, which is a separate entity in the bank as it votes its proxies. Discussions are going to continue on that. The bottom line is that investment managers and pension funds are being scrutinized as never before in terms of the engagements they lead on climate change and the votes they take. Finally, it's really notable that both J.P. Morgan Chase and BlackRock have joined the Climate 100 Plus initiative, which is a group of global investors putting pressure on companies to aggressively address climate change. That group, investors in Climate 100 Plus, now have over $41 trillion of assets under management. So these are a few signs of encouragement as we face grim and sobering scientific evidence about the impact of climate change, that impact from Australia to California. Thanks very much for being able to be part of this.
We're grateful, Tim. Thanks. Great. Okay, let's move then to Amina Rubin, Senior Marketing Specialist for Azzad Asset Management. Amina will discuss shareholder work highlighting human rights risks in the tech sector. Go ahead, Amina.
Thank you, Susana. The growing number of engagements with information, communications, and technology companies makes clear shareholders' concerns about the sector's exposure to human and civil rights risks. While ICT companies may project idealistic principles, shareholders are concerned by increasing evidence of companies' actions contradicting those stated principles and by the business and reputational risks that this brings. This year, ICCR members filed proposals with ICT companies concerning government censorship and surveillance, as well as data privacy, the sexual exploitation of children online, board oversight on human rights, hate speech and products that promote it, and the company treatment of whistleblowers. In recent years, the issue of tech companies complying with government censorship or surveillance requirements has drawn increasing concern from investors. In a response to our shareholder proposal last year, Alphabet emphasized that Google is, quote, committed to making the world's information available to everyone. Now, ironically, it used this argument to justify expanding its services into countries whose authoritarian governments require the company to comply with censorship laws and black out broad categories of information on subjects like human rights, nonviolent resistance, democracy, religion, and more. Last year, while we were in dialogue with Alphabet about a proposed censored and surveillance-enabled search product for China, an anonymous Google employee revealed that the company had started complying with long-standing Russian government demands to remove certain content. Similar reports emerged around the same time that Google had already been censoring content at the request of India's government. In response to this new information, we filed a resolution this year asking Alphabet to consider publicly disclosing a list of the terms and sites it removes from search results in response to requests from governments. Shareholders are concerned that Google complying with content takedown requests from governments threatens the right to freedom of expression and puts Alphabet in a position of censoring users around the world. Our concern increases with the possibility that those governments are using Google products to track what topics people search and are then targeting some of those people based on their political or religious beliefs or because they're journalists. Another important factor on the issue of data privacy and government surveillance relates to how we learn about it. Much of the information we know about Google cooperating with the demands of authoritarian governments has come from whistleblowers. Therefore, another resolution asks Alphabet to evaluate the way it treats whistleblowers in such cases and to consider expanding its policies to protect employees who reveal information that's important to the public interest or who speak up if they see the company failing its commitments to human rights. In line with these concerns about Alphabet's human rights risks, another resolution asks the company to establish an independent human rights risk oversight committee for its board of directors. And on the issue of data privacy, shareholders are asking Verizon to consider implementing user privacy protections for the vast amounts of data that it collects about its customers. Another resolution asks Facebook to reboot itself to address mismanagement around privacy and data collection. And an additional proposal asks Facebook to nominate a civil and human rights expert to its board with the goal of changing the way the company handles hate speech on its platform. On the disturbing issue of the sexual exploitation of children online, shareholders are concerned that tech companies and internet service providers are not doing enough to prevent the distribution or promotion of abusive content. Resolutions have been filed with Alphabet, AT&T, Facebook, and Verizon, asking those companies to closely examine the risk that their platforms or products are being used to exploit children and to issue public reports on the findings. At Amazon, shareholders are concerned about how U.S. law enforcement and immigration agencies are using the company's surveillance products and cloud-based services. They're asking the company to do due diligence on whether its customers' use of these products contributes to human rights violations. And another resolution asks Amazon to report on its efforts to address hate speech, as well as the sale of offensive products that promote hate speech on its marketplace. In responding to shareholder concerns, tech companies often give vague statements, such as saying that they conduct proper human rights due diligence. Given the magnitude of the stakes, investors are asking ICT companies to formalize and make transparent their policies and actions for how their products impact human and civil rights.
Terrific. Amina, thank you so much. I just want to remind members of the audience that they can put their questions in the queue using the question box in the lower right-hand side of their screen. And now we are going to move to Nicholas Lusiani, Senior Advisor for Corporate Advocacy for Oxfam America, who will cover investor engagements with the pharmaceutical industry around drug pricing and Oxfam's proposal regarding the allocation of corporate tax savings. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Thank you, Susana. Hello, everyone. You know, every day we hear harrowing stories about the real human toll of the unrelenting rise in the cost of U.S. healthcare, much of which is driven by increased prices in patented pharmaceutical products. You know, pharma companies can and have done tremendous good, contributing a lot of cutting-edge medicinal breakthroughs which improve people's lives. Yet today's pharma model, which is full of opacity and riskiness, pose really serious challenges to long-term investors. So it's a pleasure today to engage with you on a couple of different issues. First of all, shining more sunlight on drug pricing risks. And second of all, ensuring that capital allocation is aligned with longer-term value creation. Both of these issues, if supported, would provide investors the information we need to make both material financial assessments as well as really material ESG assessments. So first, turning to drug pricing, as you may know, about 60% of Americans report currently taking at least one prescription medicine. Many of them worry that they won't be able to afford those medicines tomorrow. In fact, about 1 in 4 adults say they or a family member have not filled a prescription or skipped doses because of cost. We've heard harrowing stories of rationing that have cost lives. In response, there's been a wildly popular and bipartisan efforts both in Washington and in state capitals across the country to drive down prices. These pose serious material risks to those pharma companies which are dependent on price for growth. How much of the sector is dependent on price for growth? Well, in 2017, Credit Suisse found that price spikes accounted for about 80% of pharma industry earnings growth. And we haven't seen a lot of changes in that indicator since. As investors, we're concerned that certain compensation arrangements for senior executives, which are based on a mix of sales and EPS growth metrics, may be driving decision-making in the companies, which deepens these risks related to drug pricing. So both sales growth and earnings depend on increasing revenues, as you know, through some combination of increasing volume or raising prices. For companies that are relying on price spikes for growth, senior executive compensation arrangements therefore may inadvertently incentivize senior executives to increase drug pricing to ensure short-term revenue targets at the expense of long-term value creation. So this is why, as investors, we face a dire need for more disclosure. With your support in the past years, we've been successful at driving some very important agreements and resolutions to proposals, and we urge you moving forward to really support the resolutions both on creating a feasibility report and increasing more disclosure on the issue of drug pricing risks and executive compensation. Turning to the question of the allocation of corporate tax savings. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act led to an historic 100, probably a little bit more, depending on your estimate, $100 billion in corporate tax savings in its first operative year in 2018. No matter one's views on the desirability or the need of these tax cuts, once in play, they represent a rare opportunity to strengthen long-term value creation by giving companies new after-tax cash flow that can be used to invest in capital expenditure, in improved employment, research and development, and making products more affordable. How companies, especially pharmaceutical companies, are choosing to deploy this new after-tax cash flow is strategic as well as an important policy issue for investors that are looking over the medium to long term. As a major beneficiary of the corporate tax cuts of 2017, the U.S. pharmaceutical sector had a chance and continues to have a chance to transform its new after-tax cash flow into mitigating the risks I mentioned around relying on price spikes for growth by decreasing prices, Or they could use this after-cash tax flow to increase their research and development to solve some of the world's most current and future health challenges. What's happened instead, about 8 of the 10 leading pharma companies paid out more to shareholders in open market share repurchases and dividends than they invested in research and development, sometimes much, much more. I won't go into too much detail, but just quickly take the case of Merck, the main subject of the shareholder proposal this year. In 2018, the company was estimated to receive between $1 and $2 billion in tax savings, and it should receive up to $7 billion through 2025. This is a great opportunity to reinvest these earnings, these savings in long-term value creation. Instead, the company doubled its share repurchases in 2018 from $4 to $9 billion. Its research and development has flatlined since 2016 and actually dropped in 2018 by $500 million, threatening long-term value. So we think that, we don't have enough after 1 year to make any determining conclusions, and that's why we really want to pose this question to companies, whether their use of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act savings aligns with the company's strategy for long-term value creation. And we really encourage you to support this. Thank you very much.
Great, Nicholas. Thanks so much. Okay, and finally, we'll turn to Caroline Boden, Shareholder Advocacy Manager for Mercy Investment Services. Caroline will discuss ICCR member engagements to mitigate the risks of forced labor and trafficking in global supply chains. Take it away, Caroline.
Thank you, Susana, and good morning, everyone. Today, I'll be speaking about the importance for companies to address human and worker rights issues, and will highlight a few of the 52 shareholder proposals filed this proxy season on human rights, trafficking, and forced labor issues. Modern slavery continues to be a prominent global issue, with 40 million victims of trafficking, forced labor, and other forms of modern-day slavery on any given day. We have all heard the stories and read the news reports about child labor in the cocoa industry, unsafe working conditions in garment factories, or the use of forced labor in internment camps in China's Xinjiang province. In response to these and other abuses, consumers are demanding ethically sourced products. Regulatory bodies, such as the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, may prevent the import of goods produced with forced labor, and a growing number of national governments are calling for mandatory human rights due diligence processes. Companies that fail to take a proactive and comprehensive approach to mitigating their actual and potential impact on human rights may face significant reputational, financial, legal, and regulatory risks. The UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises state that companies should respect human rights by adopting internal policies, conducting due diligence, and seeking to prevent, mitigate, and remediate human rights impacts linked to their business operations. While an increasing number of companies are taking steps to address the impact of their operations and business relationships on human rights, there remain gaps in these commitments and processes. This year's shareholder proposals on human and worker rights issues focused largely on where companies are in the implementation and due diligence process. First, ICCR member, the Adrian Dominican Sisters, filed a resolution with Amazon on how the company is implementing its commitment to prohibit human trafficking in its operations. With the rapid growth of its transportation and logistics services, shareholders believe Amazon is well positioned to help address and mitigate the risk of human trafficking in the company's operations. Based on Amazon's partnership with Truckers Against Trafficking and a commitment to train their internal fleet of drivers, the resolution was successfully withdrawn. In many cases, companies have incorporated language regarding their commitment to respect human rights in their corporate governance documents, but haven't demonstrated they understand their salient human rights risks or implemented the processes to adequately remediate any harm caused. Mercy Investment Services and other ICCR members filed resolutions with both Carnival Corporation and Royal Caribbean to determine how the companies are implementing and ensuring compliance with their commitment to respect human rights. In both cases, the companies have some framework language concerning human rights in their codes of conduct or supplier guiding principles, but haven't adequately disclosed how they are implementing these commitments. The proposals highlighted the importance of going beyond policy statements and conducting human rights due diligence, which should include processes for identifying and remediating adverse human rights impacts in a company's operations and supply chain. After discussions with Carnival, we were able to successfully withdraw the resolution based on an agreement to continue engaging and identify ways for the company to strengthen and expand its efforts to respect human rights. While human rights policies and statements are an important part of the due diligence process, investors and other stakeholders are looking for evidence that companies understand their salient human rights risks, have developed the processes to address these risks throughout their operations and value chain, and have implemented systems of remediation with input from impacted stakeholders. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Super, Caroline, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move into the Q&A now. I just want to remind everyone, if you could, as you're putting your questions in, just tell us who you are and your organization and which speaker your question is directed to. That would be really helpful. So, Beth, there are two questions that are very similar for you, one from Michelle Wilson, Athens Impact Socially Responsible Investments, and another from Sarah Nash. I'm going to read the more fulsome question from Sarah Nash. The question is for Beth Young. Can you tell us, under the proposed SEC rules, will multiple shareholders be able to combine to meet the proposed thresholds? You mentioned proposed changes to the ability to aggregate on your slide, but didn't go into the detail of that piece.
Right, yeah. I for time reasons, I didn't mention that, but yes, the proposal is to prohibit aggregation, which is, aggregation is not currently in the rule, but had always been permitted sort of more informally by both the staff and I think with the knowledge of the commission, and the proposal is to do away with that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Beth. I have a question for Amina from Richard Stuzinski. Amina, as part of Azzad's engagement efforts on human rights in tech, are you engaging with private equity firms or the public banks that support them around the risks of surveillance tech, given that many companies such as NSO Group are not publicly held?
That's an excellent question. The aspect of banks and financial institutions and their role in the issues we advocate on Azzad is a Islamic finance investing institution, and so we don't hold financial institutions. So for the most part, we don't engage with that aspect of it. Although I do follow other companies' engagements on those aspects when they take the finance angle, but that's not something that we've been able to do.
Okay, I have a question for Nicholas from Daniela Carozio, Sustainable Value Investors. Can you please tell us more about the drug pricing risks and executive compensation feasibility report? It would be great to have inclusion of ESG criteria in the executive compensation, linking executive comp to development of life-saving products and indicators of access to medicines. What do you think? Is this something ICCR shareholders can ask big pharma companies?
Well, thanks very much for the question. I think it's a proposal that we should look more into. For the most part, we're looking here at just the considerations of the reliance on companies for drug pricing for growth and its impacts on incentive structures within the C-suite primarily. But I would love to talk more about how we might be able to integrate some of these ESG considerations. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Nico. Question for Caroline from Frank Sherman. Several HRDD human rights due diligence proposals were successfully challenged at the SEC. Do you have human rights assessment, or is that a human rights impact assessment proposal language that has survived SEC scrutiny?
Thanks, Frank, and that's a great question. We did note this year that there were concerns relating to human rights impact assessment resolutions and whether that language would survive SEC challenge. Particularly, there was a resolution filed with Sturm Ruger, a gun manufacturer, on human rights impact assessment, and that was withdrawn due to concerns of their challenge at the SEC. I think this is something that ICCR members and other shareholders are always working around in terms of learning and adapting based on the decisions and the actions of the SEC, and continue to develop and adapt the language of the resolutions so that it hopefully can survive any no action requests from companies. So I'm happy to provide examples offline, but again, it's something that shareholders are continuing to work on to adapt that language and make it more robust.
Okay, great. Thanks, Caroline. Question from Lara Blecher, and I'm going to stick with you, Caroline, for this one. There has been a lot of discussion about human rights risks. The UNGP's focus on human rights impact, and practically speaking, human rights risks can't be addressed until human rights impacts have been addressed. So are investors willing to focus more on human rights impact in resolutions going forward?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think sort of the overall trend, again, that we're seeing with a lot of the proposals is getting companies to go beyond those policy statements and commitments, and to really looking at that due diligence process that's outlined by the UNGPs. And part of what that includes is conducting human rights impact assessments so that a company really understands the salient human rights risks that they are potentially facing or are linked to either in their operations or throughout their supply chains. And we are starting to see more movement on this issue from companies, as well as I had mentioned, movement from national governments to really push for this type of reporting and assessment processes. So it's something, again, that we will continue to push for with resolutions going forward. And as I just commented to Frank's question, that we'll just have to be mindful of that language and the positioning of the SEC as well.
Okay, great. So Caroline, we'll let you rest. Let's move to Tim Smith. We have a question for you, Tim, from Jean-Francois Obregon, who asks, what appetite is there to engage financial institutions / asset managers on deforestation risks?
Very good question. And clearly, deforestation issues are a very central issue related to climate change. So as one talks to managers, say your manager's BlackRock, or as one talks to companies like BlackRock where you own shares, that's a very legitimate question. There are resolutions that have been put forward about deforestation. So one question to JP Morgan or BlackRock is, how do they plan to vote on those? And recognizing, by the way, that some of the large firms own virtually everything, right? So they would be voting on those resolutions. JP Morgan Chase, in its announcement this week, did reference deforestation. So it's seen, I think, by the big investment firms as a very legitimate area to work on. I would say, though, now for a confessional note, I think we've seen very few investors or large investment firms like Vanguard or BlackRock stand up and champion deforestation issues. Palm oil did indeed get a lot of focus and support. So sometimes when you go to a very specific subset of the deforestation issue, it quickly gets traction. But overall, I think there's probably only a modest amount of work that has been done to date on deforestation. I do know, however, that groups from all the way from Friends of the Earth to As You Sow are actively trying to up the dialogue on this. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks.
Super. Thanks, Tim. Okay, Beth, returning to you, question from Bruce Herbert from Newground Social Investment. Does the imposition of the new rules suggest that shareholders should file as early as possible for 2021, even the day after 2020 annual shareholder meetings, so as to qualify under current rules?
It seems likely that assuming that the SEC sticks to the projected timeline of adopting final rules in April, it seems likely that those rules will become immediately effective and will be in place then, even if shareholders submit a resolution immediately after the meeting in 2020, in spring of 2020. It's also possible that the way that the SEC talks about the effective date could pull in folks regardless of when they file their proposal, because it could be couched in terms of proposals submitted for meetings in, the following anytime after, say, June 1st, 2020. So even if you were to be able to get your proposal in right away because the meeting was being held after the effective date, you might still be under the new rules. So I think it's unlikely that that will work. I don't want to say impossible.
Okay, Beth, really quickly, one last question because we're almost at time, and if you could just make this brief in response to a question from Tim Brennan. One of the arguments for revising 14A8 rules is the decline of the number of public companies. Is it a fact that there are now more privately financed companies and fewer public companies and IPOs? It is argued that the cumbersome shareholder resolution process is a disincentive to going public. In your view, is there any truth to this?
No. Even the costs, the rather inflated costs used by the SEC in its release, which, let's keep in mind, are borne only by a very small proportion of public companies, those costs are dwarfed by the annual revenues and income of those companies. They are a tiny, tiny fraction of 1%. There are many, many other reasons why companies might be choosing not to become part of the public markets, including much more availability of financing outside of that setting. I think that is just one of those arguments that the corporate lobby likes to surface in order to make people more sympathetic to the notion that the shareholder proposal process is broken.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you, Beth. And thank you to all of our speakers today. We're very grateful for your extending yourselves to ICCR this way. And for all of you, thanks for joining today. Any questions left unaddressed, we'll answer via email. So don't hesitate to follow up with us. And I think Julie's left our emails somewhere on this deck so that you can contact us. We are going to email the link to the proxy book a little bit later today. The recording will be available. The deck will be available. We got a lot of questions about that. And we just want to underscore one more time the importance of remaining active owners of your stock and exercising your rights as shareholders by voting your proxies. So again, thank you all very much for joining us today and have a super day.